It was a dark and eerie night in New Orleans. The city, known for its historic charm and lively spirit, had long been shrouded in rumors and stories of the supernatural. But there was something else, something far more sinister creeping through the fog-drenched streets. Something human, yet monstrous. The tale you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. It's the story of the Mad Butcher of New Orleans. It was the early 1900s, a time when the city still whispered of old Creole secrets and hidden dangers. People walked the streets with an unspoken wariness, as if the very air around them carried a curse. And for a time, the city carried on in relative peace, until a string of grisly murders shocked even the most hardened souls. It started with the disappearances. It wasn't anything unusual at first. People went missing from time to time in a city as busy and chaotic as New Orleans. But then, the bodies began to show up, discovered in alleyways, abandoned warehouses, and under the cover of thick, oppressive fog. The first victim, a young woman named Marie Dupré, was found in the worst possible condition. Her body was sliced open, her flesh stripped away as though it had been carved by someone with a cold, surgical precision. But what was most chilling, what made people recoil in fear, was that the wounds were eerily neat, as though the killer had experience, almost like a butcher preparing a carcass for slaughter. Word spread fast through the city, and people began to lock their doors earlier each night, casting nervous glances toward the misty shadows that clung to the streets. But for a while, the murders were a mystery. Who was the Mad Butcher? Where did he come from? And what drove him to such grotesque acts? Was he just a deranged killer? Or was something darker at play? And then, the killer began to leave a trail of clues, grisly reminders of his work. Pieces of flesh, bloodied bones, and sometimes a butcher's knife, gleaming and covered in red, as if the killer wanted to send a message. But it wasn't just any message. It was a puzzle, a game. The police were frantic, working day and night to find the killer, but every lead they followed only seemed to circle back on itself. Every time they thought they were getting closer, another body would turn up. The victims were all women, young and seemingly random, with no obvious connections. Each one had been meticulously murdered, the same sickening pattern emerging with every death. But then came the night that changed everything. A young woman named Eloise, a dancer at one of the local jazz clubs, was walking home after a long shift. It was late, the streets almost deserted except for a few stragglers who hurried to get home before the night swallowed them whole. Eloise knew the city was dangerous after dark, but she didn't think much of it. That is, until she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Soft, steady, and deliberate. At first, she thought it was just someone walking the same path, but as the footsteps grew louder, she quickened her pace. She looked over her shoulder but saw nothing but shadows. Then a cold, malevolent wind swept down the street, carrying with it the stench of blood. Eloise spun around, but before she could scream, she felt something cold and sharp pressed against her neck. The last thing she saw was a pair of gloved hands, the gleam of a butcher's knife reflecting the dim light of the lampposts. And then, darkness. Her body was found the next morning, discarded like a piece of meat in the alley behind the club. But this time, something had changed. The killer had left a symbol carved into her skin, a strange, twisted pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. It was the final clue, the last piece of the puzzle. The city was now in full-blown panic mode. Rumors spread like wildfire, and whispers of dark, occult practices began to make their way through the streets. The Mad Butcher was no longer just a killer. He was something more, a twisted force of nature with a taste for blood and ritual. But the police were still no closer to finding him. The pattern, the ritualistic nature of the killings, all pointed to something far beyond just a maniac. There were stories, old stories told by the city's oldest residents, of strange ceremonies held deep in the swamps, of ancient rites that demanded blood. But no one could prove the connection. Not yet. Then, in a horrifying turn of events, the Mad Butcher struck once more. This time, however, he wasn't leaving behind his usual marks. No notes, no body parts. Instead, he'd left something far worse, a warning carved into the door of an old butcher's shop in the heart of the French Quarter. The message was clear. The hunt has only just begun. And with that chilling message, the city descended into chaos. The killer was no longer just a man. He was a force, a shadow stalking the streets of New Orleans. The murders didn't stop. They only grew more grotesque, more ritualistic, and more personal. To this day, no one knows who the Mad Butcher truly was. Some say he was a man driven by madness, a butcher who had lost his mind and his morality. Others whisper that he was something darker, perhaps a practitioner of dark, forbidden magic, using his killings to invoke ancient forces. But whatever the truth may be, one thing remains certain. The legacy of the Mad Butcher still lingers in the fog-filled streets of New Orleans. And some say, if you listen closely on a dark night, you can still hear the faint sound of a butcher's knife being sharpened in the distance. But the question remains, are you brave enough to listen? Pirates Alley, tucked away in the heart of the French Quarter, might seem like just another picturesque passageway to an unsuspecting visitor. But those who venture too close after the sun dips below the horizon are met with a chilling presence. Locals know it well, and they whisper of an infamous ghost that haunts this alley, one tied to the violent, lawless days of pirate reign. It's said that this alley was once frequented by pirates in the 18th century. These men, notorious for their bloodthirsty ways and criminal deeds, made their home here in the heart of the city, amidst the shadows of New Orleans' dark history. Their presence was felt long after their reign had ended, especially by those who dared walk these very streets at night. But the most terrifying tale of Pirates Alley is that of the ghost who haunts it. Legend has it that a pirate, known only as Jean Lafitte's ghost, wanders these narrow streets at night. Some say he was a pirate who met a brutal end at the hands of his enemies, while others insist that he was executed for crimes too heinous to even speak of. Whatever the thoughts may be, the name alone sends a chill down the spine of anyone familiar with his legacy. A pirate, a smuggler, a man who played the role of both hero and villain in the annals of New Orleans' dark history. But behind the romanticized tales of treasure and adventure lies a blood-soaked trail of cruelty and treachery. His crimes? Well, they were the stuff of nightmares. It is said that Jean Lafitte was not merely a pirate. He was a ruthless king of the Gulf Coast, a man whose greed and thirst for power knew no bounds. He and his band of cutthroat men, aboard the infamous Beau Soleil, struck fear into the hearts of those who dared cross their path. Lafitte's reign of terror began long before the shores of New Orleans felt the weight of his crimes. He sailed the high seas, plundering merchant ships, killing anyone who dared resist. But it wasn't just treasure he sought. It was power, domination over the helpless. His ruthless crew had no mercy and no soul was safe. Villages were burned to the ground, and whole fleets of ships disappeared into the abyss, swallowed by the pirates' endless hunger. And then, Lafitte turned his gaze upon the heart of New Orleans itself. The city that welcomed him with open arms, thinking him a savior, was about to become the stage for his most horrifying crimes. You see, Lafitte was not just a pirate, but a master of deception. He was a man who could charm and manipulate with a smile, his voice honeyed with promises of riches and power. But behind that charm, there was death. He and his gang set up a network of smuggling operations in the city, flooding the markets with illegal goods, stolen treasures, and contraband. But their operations were more than mere theft. Jean Lafitte's men were involved in darker dealings, selling human lives to the highest bidder. They enslaved those who crossed them, chaining them like animals and forcing them into labor or worse. The cries of the enslaved could be heard echoing through the bayous at night, mournful, desperate cries that would haunt anyone foolish enough to listen. Then there were the murders carried out under the cover of night. Some say Lafitte had a taste for blood, savoring the final screams of those he sentenced to death. His men would drag those unfortunate enough to cross him into the dark alleys of New Orleans, where they would never be seen again. Bodies were tossed into the waters of the Mississippi River, their names erased from history, their families left to wonder in the dark. And while Lafitte's power grew, so did his cruelty. It's said that he would tie his victims to trees, letting them writhe in agony as the elements slowly took their lives. Sometimes he'd even make them beg for mercy, only to laugh as they were left to perish under the weight of his own twisted satisfaction. But what truly sealed Jean Lafitte's place in the dark corners of history was the betrayal of his own. The pirates who had served him, who had fought beside him, were disposed of like broken tools when they were no longer useful. Those who dared to question him were silenced, never to speak again. The streets of the French Quarter may have seemed peaceful, but beneath that silence, a darkness festered, a darkness born of Lafitte's cold, calculating mind. Whatever the truth may be, the ghost of Jean Lafitte, or what some believe to be his vengeful spirit, still lingers. Witnesses report seeing a tall, shadowy figure draped in tattered pirate garb, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire, his presence as cold as the grave. He's said to appear suddenly, standing at the alley's entrance, blocking the way of anyone who dares pass through. The unlucky souls who cross his path often feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air itself is suffocating them. And some say, if you stand still long enough, you'll hear the faint sounds of ghostly laughter, followed by the distinct clinking of coins, treasures once stolen from unsuspecting victims, as if the pirate himself is mocking the living, toying with their fear before vanishing back into the shadows. In the heart of New Orleans, nestled on Royal Street, stands a mansion with a past so dark it's been etched into the city's haunted history. It's a place where shadows linger longer than they should, and the air feels heavy with the weight of its unspeakable secrets. The LaLaurie Mansion, a once glorious home that has now become infamous for its gruesome history, a place where the walls themselves seem to whisper the twisted horrors that occurred inside. It was 1834, on a warm spring night, when the horrifying truth about the LaLaurie Mansion was finally revealed. The events unfolded after a fire broke out in the mansion's kitchen, a fire that would uncover a nightmare more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. At first, it appeared to be a simple kitchen fire, nothing out of the ordinary. But when the flames were finally quelled, firefighters made a chilling discovery that would haunt them forever. As they explored the mansion's upper floors, they came across a locked door, a door that led to the attic, a place the LaLauries had always kept off limits. And what they found inside was beyond comprehension, a chamber of horrors unlike any the world had ever seen. Inside the attic were dozens of enslaved people, bound and tortured in unimaginable ways. Some were barely alive, their bodies scarred and mutilated by the hands of their captor, Madame Delphine LaLaurie. The room smelled of decay and death, bodies were chained to the walls, while others were piled on the floor, their bodies contorted in grotesque, unnatural positions. These were not just victims of cruelty, they were tortured souls who had been subjected to unthinkable abuse, their suffering stretching for years. Whispers in the streets spoke of Delphine's obsession with beauty and youth, and how she sought to preserve them at any cost. It is said that she performed horrific experiments on the enslaved, using them as her test subjects in cruel, sadistic ways. The details of her atrocities are too vile to recount fully, but the images of twisted bodies and the sounds of agonized screams still echo in the mansion's walls. But the horrors didn't end with the fire. The mansion was quickly abandoned, and Delphine LaLaurie herself fled, disappearing into the shadows of history. But that was not the end of the story, because as the years passed, people started to talk. Those who dared to enter the LaLaurie mansion reported strange occurrences, cold spots, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, whispers in the dark, and always the feeling of being watched. So, if you ever find yourself walking through the French Quarter, just remember this. There's a place where the past is never really gone. A place where the horrors of history still linger, waiting to drag you into the darkness. The LaLaurie Mansion stands as a monument to the worst of human nature, its story a haunting reminder that some ghosts never leave. It was late February, and the streets of New Orleans were alive with the thrum of Mardi Gras. Crowds lined the sidewalks, their laughter, music, and the rhythmic beat of brass bands filling the air. Everything about the city felt electric, a celebration of life, culture, and freedom. But for Emily, it was a trip that was supposed to be about fun, a week of indulgence, new experiences, and escaping the grind of her everyday life in Chicago. She had always been drawn to the mystique of New Orleans. There was something about its history, the voodoo, the ghost stories, the shadowy corners of the French Quarter, that intrigued her. It was a place of contradictions, vibrant yet eerie, ancient yet modern, haunted yet alive. She had booked her trip months ago, carefully crafting an itinerary that included everything from mask-filled parades to haunted tours through centuries-old cemeteries. The first few days were everything she had hoped for. She reveled in the chaos of Bourbon Street, the elaborate floats, and the heady mixture of beignets, gumbo, and bourbon. Yet, something strange began to happen. It started subtly, a fleeting sensation she couldn't explain. Every time Emily turned a corner, she would catch glimpses of people watching her from a distance, their eyes dark, unblinking. They weren't part of the crowd. They stood out, just on the periphery of her vision, like shadows waiting to engulf her. It wasn't until the night of Mardi Gras itself that things took a darker turn. Emily and her friends had joined a parade, dancing through the streets, surrounded by thousands of strangers. But by the end of the evening, the excitement started to fade. Her friends had wandered off, and Emily found herself alone near St. Louis Cathedral, the heart of the French Quarter. It was nearly midnight, and the crowd was thinning. The music had died down, and only a few revelers remained, their voices now quieter, more hushed. As she walked along Chartres Street, she felt an odd chill despite the warmth of the air. Her breath came out in visible puffs, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. That's when she saw them. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Shadows moving along the alleyway, figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But when she squinted, she could make out their forms, tall, hunched figures, draped in dark, ragged clothing, their faces obscured by shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she quickened her pace, but the figures kept following. No matter how fast she walked, they stayed just behind her, keeping a distance yet closing in. She could feel the weight of their presence, a coldness creeping up her spine. Desperately, she turned down an unfamiliar street, hoping to lose them. But the alley she entered felt wrong, its walls too close, the air thick and suffocating. Emily had heard the stories of spirits that roamed the French Quarter, drawn to the revelry of Mardi Gras. Many believed that the spirits of the restless dead, from the old graveyards to the haunted plantations, came alive during the celebration, hitching rides on the high energy of the crowds. But Emily didn't believe in ghosts. Not until now. She turned a corner, only to be greeted by an overwhelming sense of dread. It was like she had stepped into a completely different world, one where the liveliness of the city had vanished. The streets were empty, and the sound of her footsteps echoed ominously in the silence. The figures were no longer just following her, they were surrounding her. Their faces, hollow and pale, began to emerge from the shadows. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come." Emily spun around, but no one was there. The air seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on her, making it harder to breathe. She looked down the street and saw nothing but blackness, no lights, no people, just an impenetrable void. Frantically, Emily began to run, but the spirits followed her, their footsteps in perfect sync with hers. She darted through the alleyways, down narrow streets, but it felt as though she was running in circles, like the city itself was shifting, trapping her in a maze of shadows. The whispers grew louder, mocking her. "You shouldn't have come." Somehow she found her way back to the main road, and as the lights of the busy streets came into view, the figures disappeared. They were gone, but their presence lingered. Her heart was racing, her skin clammy with sweat. She quickly made her way back to her hotel, shaking, trying to convince herself it had been some kind of hallucination, the product of too much excitement and too many drinks. But the nightmare didn't end there. That night, as Emily lay in her hotel bed, unable to sleep, she heard it, a tapping on her window. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. She bolted upright and looked out into the darkness. There was no one there. The window was shut tight, but the tapping continued, faint but unmistakable. She tried to ignore it, burying her head in the pillow, but the sound wouldn't stop. The next morning, she checked out, eager to leave the city behind. She felt the need to be far away, to escape the pull of the spirits that had followed her. But as she boarded the plane back to Chicago, she noticed something strange. On the reflection of the window, a figure stood behind her, its face pale and empty. It was one of them, the spirits. By the time she landed in Chicago, Emily was convinced that her experience had been real. She had never believed in ghosts before, but there was no denying what had happened to her in New Orleans. And the worst part? She knew, deep down, that the spirits hadn't left her behind. They had followed her back, lingering in the shadows of her life, waiting for the next chance to claim her soul. Every night since her return, she could hear the faint tapping on her windows, like a distant knock from beyond. She's tried everything, calling on experts, trying to cleanse her home, but nothing works. It's as if the spirits of Mardi Gras have decided she belongs to them now, and one day, when they're ready, they'll come to collect. So, if you ever find yourself in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, just remember Emily's story. Keep your eyes open, and whatever you do, never stray too far from the crowd, because the spirits are always watching, and sometimes they follow you home.